Any tapes, historians are having a field day with them.
That's right. It's the former First Lady, in her own words, in her own voice, answering questions on tape 4 months after the assassination of her husband, John F. Kennedy. The interview has been kept under wraps for nearly 50 years until now.
Oh, and they're just so fascinating. Deb Favorite is here to share. Please.
Once you start listening, it's very hard to stop. And, you know, it's so interesting because she had such strong opinions and impressions. She knew she was being recorded for history. So, you know, in some ways, maybe she did hold back. What's refreshing is the candor, this wispy, gentle voice expressing what she felt. After her husband won the presidency, for example, she describes Richard Nixon's wife as looking, quote, exhausted like a cadaver, terribly bitter. She describes one of the cabinet members as a man, quote, terribly afraid to make a decision. She weighs in on Indira Gandhi, calling her a real prude, and she was taken aback by civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr.'s private life.
When we said what an incredible speaker he was during that Freedom March thing, and, you know, when he acknowledged that having made that call during the campaign got them. Then he told me of a tape that the FBI had of Martin Luther King when he was here for the Freedom March. And he said this with no bitterness or anything. How he was calling up all these girls and arranging for a party of men and women, I mean, sort of an orgy in the hotel and everything.
Martin Luther King?
Oh, yeah. And first he said, oh, you know, and I said, oh, but Jack, that's so terrible. I mean, that man is, you know, such a phony then.
You know, the people she liked, she called sweet, and you sense how people became entranced by this very refined, very elegant young woman who was just in her early 30s. While JFK's affairs are now legendary, listening to her speak, it is clear she loved her husband. She describes his excitement, buying her gifts, how he would call her from the campaign trail when she was home pregnant with Caroline and John. Take a listen.
I was always a liability to him until we got to the White House. And he never asked me to change or said anything about it. Everyone thought I was a snob from Newport who had bouffant hair and had French clothes and hated politics. And then because I was often having these babies, I wasn't able to campaign, you know, be around them as much as I could have. And he gets so upset with me when something like that came out. And I sometimes they say, oh, Jack, I wish, you know, I'm so sorry for you that I'm just such a dud. And he knew it wasn't true, and he didn't want me to change. I mean, he knew I loved him, and I did everything I could, and when I did campaign with him, I did it very hard.
And what's so interesting is you can hear various ambient noise, like the plane there in the background. You hear John at times coming in and talking to his mom, or the sound of ice clinking in glasses. But Jackie Kennedy really defined the role of the First Lady. She undertook a complete restoration of the White House, turning it into this jewel of American history. And she says, well, she feared that the presidency might ruin her marriage. In fact, she says it was the happiest time of her life. And you really listen to her evolving and learning from her husband. And there's something I love. You know, she was carrying a grudge around, somebody who had been angry at John Kennedy. And so she says, Jack was so sweet. He sort of rubbed my back, and he said, if you start to say or think that you hate someone, then the next day you'll act as if you hate him. And so he was saying, you know, don't do this. It's not worthy. And he was really very political, and she really learned from all of that. Her daughter, Caroline, who approved of all of them in their entirety being published now 50 years after the presidency, she said that she could hear her mother's voice and knew what she was thinking by the way she was saying things, and that it was actually a kind of a communion between the two of them, listening to all these tapes again. Absolutely. And when you hear that voice and saying, oh, she was a real prune, there's no real anger or hatred, rancor. You know, that kind of tone that we tend to hear a lot these days, that's absent in her voice.
Very nice.
Well, it's not nice, but it's certainly not nasty. There's lacking in nastiness almost, and that's, I think, what I found so.
Actually, it's her way of speaking that intrigues me, because does anyone talk like that anymore? I mean, it's like they used to talk in the movies.
It's so upper crust. It's finishing school, isn't it? Like the finishing school upper crust. Absolutely, and it was a time when, you know, women were not overly prominent in politics. They didn't have that kind of a strong voice. Doesn't mean that she wasn't a strong woman. In fact, she was a very strong woman. She had to undergo a lot. So it's just fascinating to listen to this time in history and her perspective as a wife, as somebody that close to the president.
You don't like the whole prune thing. You don't think it's any nice way of calling somebody a prune?
No. I'm just being honest.
Thanks, Deb.
Also new this morning, thank you, Deb, that was really fascinating. Also new this morning, the New England Patriots